Welcome back to another episode of The Beginner's Guide to the 18th Century. My name is Kendall, and today I am joined by, once again, an incredible guest. I only have the best guest here on The Beginner's Guide. I am thrilled to introduce you to someone who has been incredibly inspiring to me lately. His social media, everything that he's posting, his YouTube channel, so much so that I was like, you have to come on the show and we have to have a conversation. Daryian Kelton is a historic interpreter and also the social media coordinator of a historic site called the Old Barracks Museum. Welcome, 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 Daryian. I'm so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be on here.
I want to start out the way that we always start out here, and I would love to know about your story. What drove you to start a career in living history? Because I know that you're also a drummer, which we could talk about all the fun in that. So you have all of these great, exciting things going on at the same time. But I am really curious what drove you to become a historic interpreter.
Well, this story is kind of long and convoluted, but I'll try to shorten it down as much as I can.
Those are the best stories, though.
It all started way back, early teenage years. I can't exactly remember pinpointing when, probably around like 14-ish. My mom took me to this event at Washington's Crossing State Park on the New Jersey side. There is a difference. There's a New Jersey side and a PA side. We're on the New Jersey side, and we went to a history fair. And I saw some folks from the barracks there, but also my uncle wound up being there as one of the representatives of the barracks. And he was talking about, his reenacting group, which was the first Rhode Island 60 USCTs, because they do both Revolutionary War and Civil War. So he got me involved with that, and I was solely interested because of the fact that I needed an excuse to play the drums. And so they were like, we need a drummer. And I was like, hey, Mom, they need a drummer. And she was like, well, I don't know. So like, he came to the house, he ran it all down, like talked about what we do, explained it to my mom. And the first event I went to was Fort Pocahontas, which was kind of cool because my first time like doing old timey camping and also learning old timey drills. And then there was an event called the Battle of Bordentown, which is just one of those like events that like, it's an event for the sake of an event. But there was when I got like my first experience like working with the History Channel and like doing film for them. Though I never saw the fruits of that labor, and I never found out they actually used any of that stuff. It didn't even matter. The fact that like I was at the right place at the right time, and like there was also a fife and drum corps there, which coincidentally I wound up joining, which was the fifes and drums at the Old Barracks. And then from there I transitioned into doing fifes and drums at the Old Barracks for a very long time. I very seldomly have a 4th of July off for that reason. And then after that, I just continually stuck around volunteering, giving tours, learning as much as I could. So the summer months, like I was there, whatever I could. And eventually, after I went off to school, I was always frequently coming back home. So I would always check in and stuff like that. And then I actually didn't finish school, which is really weird to say in a room full of people who have like way more on paper qualifications than I do, but I've read all the same books as them. But what wound up happening is just due to like financial issues and one thing led to another, I just couldn't go back for my second year, which was like a bummer. It was an extreme bummer. And I was also supposed to do a tour, which was part of the reason why I didn't go back, and that tour fell through. And I learned a valuable lesson in the music industry that day, rather that month, which is don't put all your eggs in one basket. But in the midst of doing all that, it turned out that they were looking to hire folks to come into the Old Barracks Museum, and I was one of the people chosen by my uncle. He threw my name in the hat, and I was picked to come in and work. And so after that, I just kind of stayed there. So I've been there for 6 years now. 6 years as of April, this past April. And now I'm doing social media stuff, making videos, doing African American interp, writing programs, all types of stuff.
Do you feel like this is absolutely your calling to be in this work?
It goes back and forth every
Mhm.
now and then. Like I go through these phases of like, yeah, absolutely, and then it's like, no, I really want to do music.
Right. It is hard when you have multiple passions, when you have things that you've put your, and I think especially as anybody who's an artist or a musician, anybody in that field of having an artistic career, I think the soul probably drives that need to really focus on that. One of the things that really clued me in that we needed to have a conversation was recently when you shared when you did a live video on, I think it was 4th of July, right? And it was so impactful. It's a lot to unpack, and it's important that we do. This is incredibly important work. It's been important work forever, and I always say I'm still really, only 2.5 years into this community, so I'm still sort of figuring my place in all of that. So I look to people who are experts, and I consider you one of those people. In the, you're in the trenches, you're in it, and you're in it every day, and you're dealing with it, and you have shared, the one thing that was so incredibly important for me to hear was when you talked about being an interpreter, giving this information to a white crowd and having them look at the white interpreter over your shoulder to make sure to validate what you were saying. We have to keep talking about this, and we have to keep making this right and better and do more. So we want to talk about all of those things. And what we especially want to talk about, because this is the beginner's guide to the 18th century, so we want to educate people about how important these things are, what your part is, because I think oftentimes as a person new to the community, you're just overwhelmed because you don't even know what you're supposed to do. You don't know how you're supposed to be. I say that because I've been that person, trying to figure out who you are as a human being outside of the historical community. Now I've understood you just be the same person. It's not separate, but it can feel a little bit overwhelming and confusing because of this complicated history that we are telling. The other thing that is so important for us to talk about is how to help African American people who are interested in becoming interpreters, who are interested in being living historians and being in this world, because access is not open to them in the same way that it is to people like me and other people who look like me. And I know that you are very passionate about helping to create access to people, and you are working on some programming and different things that is going to really open that door up for people. So I want to talk about all that stuff in whatever order you want to talk about, whatever the thing that is most on your mind right now, that we can share and have a conversation that will help other people to understand how we can do better.
To go back to the beginning, that video, that live stream that I did was on 4th of July. It was basically my take on how I personally feel on 4th of July. This topic is a very, very hard topic to unpack. In fact, we just got another interpreter, and this is a woman. This is actually one of the first African American interpreters that we've had outside of myself in a while, since my uncle retired. So I was going through 18th century African American history with her, and like we only scratched the surface, and I was
Mhm.
talking to her for an hour. So so it gets really, 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 really complicated, really, really fast. But the point of that live stream was to showcase something more personal rather than educational. And also, in sharing something personal, you also share something educational,
Yes.
just
Yes.
inherently.
I mean, I really want people to go on Instagram and watch it, and we'll have your link. It's at the real Daryian Kelton, but I'll have that in the show notes everywhere, because it is educational. I know it was like personal, and it was sharing about, your reasons for not really feeling very celebratory on 4th of July, but it was the education, the teachable moment there about what it was like for the enslaved on the 4th of July, and what that experience in those years after that. And it was just, it's information that we should all know, but we're not taught in school. We're not taught those things. It's not in our textbooks. And I think that's really what's coming to light now, as people are, oh, I wasn't taught this stuff. And I think it's so much up to the history community to be sharing this, but also right now it's difficult to be the history community, right? And I think in your position, even more so.
Right. I mean, the way that that whole thing kind of kind of processes is like, in terms of speaking to an audience and also perspective shift. Like perspective is really, really important. Like perspective is important and words are important. And I'm probably going to come back to the second thing. Like verbiage is important, but I'll come back to that at a later time because
Okay.
that's a different thing.
Yeah.
And the way that, because I like to use illustrations, so I'll talk about that in a different
Okay.
way. But
Good.
in terms of trying to reach a particular audience or to reach people, even in my regular everyday interpretation, I tend to try to feed off of my teacher instincts. I went to school for music education. I learned child psychology, and with that comes a lot of other things. I also took sociology in high school and stuff like that. So with all of that knowledge, you realize you have to reach people where they are. So the best way to do that is by creating these illustrations that relate to them now. I realized that doing illustrations that might relate to them, but in an 18th century context, doesn't actually work because there's still that separation of, oh, that's what they did then. It was like, no, 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 no. You don't realize that all of these decisions impact right now.
Yes.
There's a lot of things that are not changing. They're not different from what they once were. And the way the way in which we're talking about it, and the way in which people are receiving it, for me, I've had a lucky experience of people receiving what I've been saying for the most part pretty well. And that's just the way that I package it. Like I feel like in my personal being, I've become a way more radical person when it comes to talking about African American history and being more upfront and in your face, less sugarcoating. And a lot of the response is met with, for instance, my cat, Keanu, we just got him neutered last week. Poor thing. But he had on a cone. And the important part about this is that we tried so many different ways to help him in that scenario. He had the cone on for a week, and we would go up to him so that he could eat. We would try to undo his collar so that we can lay the cone back so that he can go and eat. And then when he's done, we'll just put the cone back on or whatever. And even the day that we took the cone off, which was only a couple of days ago, like he was fighting us and backing himself into a corner, just like really afraid. And I say that because that's the way that this is also being perceived. Is there are some people who, just put their head down, shake their head, and they go, no, 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 there's no way that this can be true. And it's my job to stand there and go, whether you like it or not, it's the truth. Now,
Right.
the fact that you're uncomfortable about it, how do you think I feel knowing that that's my reality every day? And that's what it comes down to. That's the conversation. That's the conversation starter, at least, is bringing forth a perspective that they can relate to, like the cat analogy or the cat metaphor with the cone. That's something you can relate to every day. Like people have pets, you've seen it happen, you've seen the cone,
Yes.
everyone laughs at it, and
Yeah. Cone of
it's
shame.
the cone of shame, right? So it's something that we've all experienced and we've all
Yeah.
related to. And I think that historical interpretation needs to go beyond the books and get more personal. And when I say personal, I don't mean like us as interpreters getting, our personal feelings into it,
Right.
but making it more personal for the person having the experience, the person visiting the site, the person visiting a museum. It needs to be personal to them so that they would be more inclined to recall that information, learn from that situation, or whether they don't learn from that situation, you did your part already. And so that's really where I want to see like historical interpretation really start to move to, or at least in the realm of talking about African American history, that's the way you kind of have to move so that if you want to see change in behavior or how we say things or things of that nature.
What responsibility do white interpreters have to make sure that they are telling African American history appropriately and correctly?
They have the same responsibility that I do. And by this, I mean, every event, and I think I mentioned this in the live stream, every event that we do at my job, everyone's scrambling like, okay, we got to look up and, okay, all right, you're going to do that job. And all right, you're going to do that job. And people are looking up stuff. And then when we get to like maybe a week out or so, there's like, so what am I doing? And they go, we'll get back to you on that. Okay, so in the midst of all this research, no one took the time to stop and say, we have to find something for everyone to do, or do the bulk research or dive deeper into the research. Because the then inverse answer would be, well, why don't you just do it? Well, I can't do it because I also am a social media person. So I've got to come up with a social media plan and a marketing plan with the person who does marketing. And we have to sit down, we have to have, those meetings of what the plan is going to look like. I don't have enough hours in it, and I got to shoot stuff like videos and photos. I don't have the time to then shift over and then also just do a ton of research. Like, if I did that, I'd be running myself ragged all the time because I'm one person. I'm one person doing the job of many. And that's just a historical interpretive field. That's just a nonprofit field
Yes,
to
I
begin
was
with.
just about to say that. That's the problem. That is the problem, is the nonprofit mentality that has been brought on by, two historic sites for the last 30, 40, whatever years. And there's never enough people. There's never enough time. So it's for these smaller museums that are not state or federally funded, it's very difficult to, well then, okay, so now we have to like get the bathrooms cleaned and keep the lights on. And this is, as a vice president of a site, this is my experience. And now we have to figure out, how do we make sure we're telling the right interpretation? How do we make sure we're telling the right stories? And I think it's just the culture of, like you said, of the living history interpretation world. It's the culture in general. So that's a larger picture that needs to change. But I do think there's the smaller things that we can start doing better first.
And to more directly answer the question, because I don't want to dodge the question either, to more directly answer the question, what white interpreters can do is they could also do the research. Like, believe it or not, research is a collaborative effort when it comes to doing historical interpretation. Because if you're trying to do stuff on your own, you read the same document 10 times and you're just like, I don't get it. And then someone else reads it the first time and they go, oh, it's this. Like, it's a collaborative effort. And also, from my perspective, if I have to learn everything about the founding fathers or any person in history who did something great that doesn't look like me, I think you also have the task to do something like that. It's the same thing with women's interpretation. I mean, kudos to the entire movement for taking a huge step forward in a big way, especially in terms of history. But at the same time, just because we're talking about, women, doesn't mean you can't talk about Black women or women from the Barbados, or, what women were doing in England that were, still enslaved, or what have you. Like, that's all stuff that we're all capable of doing. So it shouldn't just be left on me to do all of the work of researching this and that. It's not just my job. Because if that was the case, then I could say, well, you need to do your job better in learning more about what the founding fathers actually did, or learning about what so-and-so was actually doing in terms of global commerce. That's the narrative. And, right now we're talking about, there's this movement of, talking about things that were, or what trades or what things have benefited from slave labor in the 18th century. And my thing about that movement is, like, though it is very informative and it's actually very cool to see, it can get real slippery really, really fast, because there's a lot of things a lot of people were not expecting to be influenced by slave culture of the 18th century. And by the way, none of that stuff really went away. It just changed.
Exactly. It's still.
You just change it. It's not
Yep.
different.
It's not. I haven't been to historic sites in the North. I don't know the culture of what the North is like, so I would not even try to compare. My experience as a lifelong Southerner, going to lots of historic sites in the South, and now being part of one, when white people, not just white people, a lot of people, show up to a historic site and they see an African American interpreter, automatically assume that person is portraying a slave.
Yep. That's my experience in a
Okay,
lot
so
of it.
in the North as well. Okay, because I am like, well, is it just because it's an expectation because we're plantations? But that was going to be my question. And then my next question is there a way to shift that paradigm?
So, all right, that's a loaded thing because this
Okay,
comes in with, starting out as an interpreter, right? So
right.
starting out in the 18th century, like this is something that we need to break because it's very detrimental, in the sense that I got to sit on the diversity committee, the diversity advisory committee for the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, which just opened like only a couple years ago. I think the
Yeah.
museum's like 4 years old. Fun fact: I have a tableau in the museum. Yay! I'm part of
I
one of the
was
tableaus.
gonna say that's so cool. That's the
Yeah.
coolest thing.
I also got to be on some of their promotional stuff as well, which is cool. But
That's cool.
also got brought back to do this diversity committee, and this is where I finally met face to face. I met Marvin Alonzo Greer, and I met Cheney McKnight,
Mhm.
Nastasia Parker, uh, Joseph McGill. I had a buddy of mine from Reservoir. His name is Noah, but he portrays Ned Hector. Um, and also Denise was there as well. I forgot her last name, but she recently just passed away. But she was also really great as well. Everyone has like this wonderful background, having done all these things and have these big reputations. And when we sat down to talk to this committee, we all had a central goal of changing the way historical interpretation works out. Because one of the questions that we got, believe it or not, that was on the docket is how do we get more African Americans to want to do this job in the history professional realm? And the problem with getting people who want to do this has to do with how my dad thought about it when I first started doing it, which was I was really excited. And when I get really excited about things, I tend to pull people in with me, like, you should do this thing with me. It's really great. And that's like, the first couple months of being excited. And my dad was like, no, why would I want to portray being a slave? And that phrase right there, that also kind of defined why I had to keep doing this, because he's not wrong that there were slaves in the 18th century or people enslaved in the 18th century. However, that's not everyone's story in the 18th century. That's not everyone's story in the 19th century. In fact, you are not born a slave. And this is where language comes in. You're not born a slave. So when we reference people, we want to humanize them, which is why we use the terms enslaved and enslaver.
Yeah.
It humanizes both parties because it is important to note that there is a conscious decision being made by people to own other people. And my biggest thing about African American history is not the portrayal of really just the hardships and the people, but understanding society at that point in time. Because when you understand the society, it makes this thing, it puts this thing into an even broader context that you probably weren't thinking of it before. Most of us think of this as just purely a United States centric problem. This is a global thing. It has a global impact, hence the movement on what is touched by, slave culture. Everything. It's everything to uncover. The way that we develop weapons is touched by it. The way that we develop technology, the way that everything kind of comes about. And also, there are these really unique stories that aren't being told. There are these people's lives who have been completely omitted from history, and it's not fair. We have the right to tell all these stories, not just the ones that we want to make statues of. We have to tell all of the stories, and to only leave the stories to be told of the docile ones, like the timid Martin Luther King, who didn't remain timid throughout the rest of his life. But I won't talk about that any further. any of these sort of folks, right? We tend to latch onto the Phyllis Wheatleys and things like that, all these timid stories, right? But what about the, why aren't people still talking about like Nat Turner? Like I haven't heard Nat Turner in a very long time. Um, things of that nature. Malcolm X hasn't been brought up nearly as much. The Black Panther Party. It's crazy to me that like I dress like a Black Panther like almost every day. The only thing I'm missing today is the beret, and it's on the couch. But the fact that I know that there are people who don't know about that organization, and the ones that do know about that organization only know the negative stuff, which was put out in the media about them, and don't know the true history of the culture. That's important. Like that's what we need to be telling. And it's not just those 60 stories, those 1960 stories. It's not just the Civil War stories, because there's a load of them. It's not just all those stories, but even 18th century, 17th, 16th, however far back you can get, those stories are not being told. And that is my job as an interpreter, is to look at the history, and it's in the title, to look at the history, digest it, and interpret it in a way that people can understand.
I think that people use the 18th century as a way to escape talking about slavery, because people just like to equate it to the 19th century just because of Civil War and, hoop skirts and antebellum houses, right? There is this as a culture, oh, this just happened in this small window of time. And when you actually participate in 18th century history telling, the entire 18th century, like everything that you're saying, everything globally, even at that point, is operating because of this, because this is happening. And so I feel like you don't, the Revolutionary War, look at the role of African Americans in the Revolutionary War, but it's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's always bothered me, because everything's romanticized, and like when we look at the 18th century, the way that it's taught, even I barely remember most of the 18th century outside of the founding fathers. There was this army that Washington crossed the Delaware. Somehow we won 19th century, and that's normally like how it happens. Like for me, because I live in New Jersey and I grew up in New Jersey and went to New Jersey schools, we spend a little bit of time and put some points of emphasis on, New Jersey history in the 18th century, and, history of just general 18th century history, because there's a lot of that here in New Jersey, being that, most of the war was fought in New Jersey. Like you can't not teach that. However, when it comes to school systems, it's very regional, I realize. I realized this when I went to California, and I was there on a gig with an artist, and we were chilling out at LAX, and we were eating, and I wound up talking to this dude. I don't even remember how this conversation started, but it was this random dude who was from, uh, somewhere, I don't remember, but he lived in California. He was like, "Oh, where are you from?" I was like, "Oh, I'm from New Jersey. I'm going back home." He was like, "Oh," uh, and we were talking about the school system and history. He was like, "What do you do?" I was like, "I normally work in a museum, and it's 18th century site." And they're like, "Oh, we don't really learn a lot of that stuff out here." That's also a problem, because that means if we're learning things regionally, the West Coast, their history pretty much starts around like the gold rush.
Yep. I want to circle back to talking about Rev War. I'm a reenactor, and so when you're with your regiment, none of those numbers match up to and I reenact with a British regiment. Those numbers, no regiments are matching up to what the actual numbers were, right? Because it doesn't make sense. Back to your original thing, how do we make this, or what you were talking about with the diversity group that you were part of, the board? You have to, and a lot of people made this point, you have to make it comfortable for people. You have to make it safe for people. There's a lot of work to do. And it's not
Yeah.
even hard work. It's not hard work. It's really not. To make a place safe and comfortable for a person to come and do what they're interested in, that shouldn't be hard.
Nope, it shouldn't be, but it is. And that's what we're talking about, right?
Yes.
um, and you're absolutely right. In fact, I was part of the 6 USCT First Rhode Island for a very long time, for most of my reenactor,
Hmm.
ness. And then a couple years ago, some buddies of mine started a regiment, which was the 17th Regiment of Foot. And I was like, well, like, there's a British story to be told here when we're looking at African Americans fighting in the war, because Lord Dunmore's proclamation, 1775.
Yep.
So if you go to an event that is 1776 and beyond, there should be some sort of representation. And we even know, even at the Boston Massacre, like there was this oh my goodness moment amongst the folk that they write about, because there is a white soldier being reprimanded, rather being, if we're going to call it what it is, being whipped by a black drummer. And like Boston almost had a fit, because they were like, this is not normal, this is not what we're used to seeing. But it's there, it's representation. Like, it's not just Crispy Sadix, it's not just him. In fact, if you look at all of the accounts, there's Crispy Sadix, and then there's several other people who are testifying saying how he died, some of which are enslaved people who are living in Boston. So when you look at events like the Boston Massacre that gets recreated every year, is there proper representation? When you look at British regiments, I decided to join the 17th, though it's not documented that they had black drummers. It was regional for me, the closest place I could go, and where I felt the most comfortable with the people I'm around. Because when you're going to events, I'm sorry to say it, but you do have to be aware of what state you're traveling to, because modern politics get warped into this hobby, like most other hobbies. And it can become very, very uncomfortable for you very, very quickly. For instance, the first event I did with the 17th, the most anticipated event of the year, back in what, I want to say like 2014, 15, 16, somewhere around there. Anyway, so when that happened, I showed up and people were losing their mind, because this is the first event I was going to with the 17th, and I had the drummer's coat. I was the drummer for the 17th.
Let me stop right there. If people have not seen a British drummer's coat, it is eye grabbing anyway, because it is beautiful and it will catch your attention.
Yeah,
You're not going under the radar.
Yeah, that's most of the reason why it was one of the most anticipated appearances, because they were like, oh, by then people still knew who I was, but I don't go to events a lot. So when I went, it was like, oh, Daryian's going to an event. Oh, he's going to be in the new drummer coat for the 17th. And we kept it mostly under wraps up until we went. And like when we went, and this was at Mount Vernon, it was a little strange being at Mount Vernon, because I was the only black guy. I was one of two black people on the British side of things at that event. And this is not even a real event. This is like a made up thing. Like, there were no battles or skirmishes at Mount Vernon in the 18th century, as far as I know. I could be dead wrong about it, but this was a made up event. This is like for us to go out, first event of the reenacting season, and just kind of, blow some powder off and, make a spectacle for everyone there. The most defining moment of that trip for me, though, was they have like this party on the green at Mount Vernon, and I went. You have the option not to go, but I went to make a point, because we're at Washington's estate, right? We're at Washington's estate, where we know for a fact he owned several people. So I felt like I would be doing a disservice to my ancestors to not go to the party and just be like, hey, this is what y'all fought for. But it's little moments like that that become the most important. Like, there's one other thing I remember about that weekend, or two other things, where one, we had some semi-dangerous stuff happening, so we had to like fake die early. But also I hopped a fence with a drum. Like that was also really cool. An 18th century fence with brand new trousers on that are like skin tight.
Yeah.
I can barely move in any of this stuff because it's all still brand new. Just
Mhm.
got it like that weekend when I showed up. Like I got my trousers when I got there. So I was wearing everything else up top except my trousers. I had to change my pants in the middle of the night in the cold in Virginia, which was not fun. But I mean, that's the experience. And I even had a very, plausible experience as just a regular soldier because um, we were one of the more progressive camps. And for all you new people coming into the hobby, don't worry about that term. But we were one of the more progressive camps. So I slipped outside. I got there late. It wasn't my fault. The messages were already divvied up, but there was nowhere for me to sleep. So I slept outside. The only thing I had over me was my greatcoat, and that was it. And I had to keep the fire alive all night so that we would have a fire to cook on in the morning. So that involved me sleeping outside in the cold because this was April. So it's cold and rainy, and it had rained the night before, so it was still wet. Well, it had rained earlier that day, so it was still wet on the ground when we went to sleep. So I'm laying on the wet ground with my greatcoat on. I'm stoking this fire every couple hours, so I didn't really sleep. And then the next morning, we eat, we have drill, and then we go out and we do the fight. That's a really close, accurate representation of like real life of being a soldier. But also, when you look at the fact that I was a black guy, I don't think this was intentional, but like that's probably pretty accurate because I also was the drummer, and so everyone has their job when you are given a mess. I was in the officers mess because I'm the drummer. I'm the short one out, right? Because I'm not the most high ranking person in the mess, and although we all split the responsibilities, it just was what it was. And so that was a very accurate representation, but guess what? No one saw it because there wasn't enough of that type of stuff. And I know there wasn't the same turnout on the Continental Line side because I went over there and I know all the people that are on that side. So all of that to say, there is a gross misrepresentation of how many rather, scratch that, how many people of color, whether they be African Americans, Native Americans,
Mhm.
or you even had Asian folk that were here. There's a lot of people here in the 18th century. It's not just, there was this 18th century society. There was black people and white people, and the black people were less and the white people were more, and that was how society was until the end of the 19th century. That is not how any of this worked. It is very complex. And the most accurate way to kind of, I don't know, depict this would be that this is almost the equivalent to what we have today in society. People coming in and out all the time because commerce is a thing. And if it was just like a black and white society, well, like that means that there's not a lot of commerce, there's not a lot of traveling. And from all of these journal accounts, people traveled a lot.
A lot, yeah.
So to say that, this wasn't here or that wasn't here, or to just omit that stuff completely by just not being there or saying, "Oh, I don't have a voice in this hobby," that's completely wrong. Everybody has a voice in this hobby. As we also talked about too, like everyone has a voice in this hobby. Whether yours is talking about, African American history, just African American history, or even just social history of the 18th century, or what have you. Like for me, just because my skin is one color doesn't mean I have to talk about African American history all the time. It's not just my job. It is the entire community's job to do that. Because the more the community accepts that, the more or the easier it will be to tell these stories in the long term and even have more proper representation statistically. And that will also probably start to change the culture of the audience that receives it as well. Because you have mentioned earlier from my live stream, like there is a lot that I deal with. And one of the things that I deal with at work is not being listened to, I guess, or taken as like a reputable source. And what will often happen, especially on days of an event, so if everybody's just moving around and we're just doing stuff, someone asks a question and I happen to know the answer, they will do one of two things. First thing they'll do is that if there's a white interpreter or someone else that is dressed in silly clothes that they think might have the answer, they'll be looking over my shoulder, looking at them to see if they're even paying attention to what I'm saying and validate what I'm saying. Because sometimes people listen to conversations by having body language. So they'll go, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so if the interpreter's not doing this, or they go, or they make that face like, I don't know about that one, well then automatically they discredit me for one small little slip up. Even if I say, I'm not sure about that, I don't want to tell you a lie. I don't. I want to tell you the truth, right? So if I don't know something, it's not my fault that I don't know something. I mean, that just means you stumped me on a question.
But that you're no different than every other historic interpreter or person who reenacts or anyone. Nobody knows everything. Everybody should be able to, I don't know. I'll check that out.
Right. There's only so much you can retain. And that's the thing. Like, yeah, I'll even see like my coworkers and colleagues, and they'll be speaking, and I'll go, I actually don't know that one. And they'll come to me to ask the question. And what often happens sometimes in that is they'll either listen or like they won't care because they had to come to me. So like the question just never gets answered because they completely bypass it. And the second thing that I notice happens is if I'm trying to answer a question or something of that nature, they just will blatantly just like not listen. Or if they have any questions, they go to they go to someone else and ask the question that I know I already gave them all the answers to. It happens.
It's just crazy. That's crazy.
And I'm in New Jersey.
Right. You're not even in North Carolina.
And it happens that way in New Jersey. And that's part of the issue.
Because it's everywhere. Because it's everywhere. Because it's in California. Because it's in Oregon. Because it's in all these places that we expect it shouldn't be, but it's everywhere. It's in the whole entire world. Let's also circle back to access. What advice, I know this is going to be, there's nothing we're going to say that's not complicated, but when somebody comes to you, an African-American person who is like, all right, I like what you're doing. I can maybe see this is, I love history, right? What's the first piece of advice you give them about considering to get into this hobby or how to start? For people who it is a hobby, I don't mean the people who are doing it professionally, but people who are volunteering or going to events.
Right. And even then, my first response would be like, if they're wanting to get into this, is, well, first I'm going to ask them, what do you know, or what have you read? Because the biggest thing is you got to arm yourself with a lot of stuff. At the beginning, you got to just dedicate yourself to understanding what you're about to do. Because if you go into this, and for me, I've been around it for a very long time. Like I practically grew up in this hobby from like 14 on. So I'm 26, I've been doing this for a while. But if you're looking to get started, you need to read and understand that the 19th century and the 18th century are two different beasts when you're talking about social history, and when you're talking about even when you're talking about African American history, it changes not nearly as drastically as you might think, but it changes because technology is starting to change a lot faster. In fact, I don't know if many people have noticed, but you, to the viewer, history has changed significantly the more technology gets involved. So as technology starts to progress, things start to change faster and faster and faster, to where you get to where we are now, where our generations are so short because of how quickly things have developed. So you have to understand that you have to take it as two separate ideas. Once you've done that, you need to emotionally prepare yourself. There is this thing called collective memory, and also generational trauma. These two things are very important to understand. You will not understand it right off the bat. You will only really understand it when you have your first encounter doing something in what we call first person. So if you don't know what first person reenacting is, that's when you portray being from that time versus third person reenacting, which is where you talk about things that happened. For instance, a lot of what we've been talking about is third person sort of if we were interpreting stuff. But if we were doing first person it's a lot of, well, I did this, I went and did that, or I would have done this. That's first person interpretation. That gets a little sticky because you have to take on that weight of that time period, and it's very heavy. I've had friends who've had breakdowns. In fact, I've had breakdowns. I had a breakdown the other day because I was reading a document and I had a breakdown. I was reading a document breaking down what things cost in the 18th century in I think in Europe, and it was a breakdown so that we could more easily equate what it would be in today's money. And I think that's what that was. And I knew what I was looking for when I went through the list because someone gave it to me. I was like, I know what I'm going to look for. I want to see how much it is to own a person. So I looked at, and it said an enslaved boy was 32 pounds. And that wrecked me for the rest of I was having a meeting to plan an event as the social media coordinator, to plan multiple events rather. And I had a breakdown in the middle of this meeting because I read how much it costs to buy a small boy, and it was only 32 pounds. 32 pounds, you know, is still a lot of money in the 18th century. But when you look at it, it's like, wow, there's really a price on a life. And that's the stuff that you're gonna encounter, especially when you're reading and stuff like that. You have to take that on and address it. And I would say, for anyone, sidebar, for anyone doing this professionally, have someone to go to to talk to and probably seek help. I'm actually looking at seeking personal help myself, just because it's a lot. You realize that a lot of these things parallel what you might have already known subconsciously, and you're just addressing it head on when you're diving deep into this. It's not an easy thing to do, though I will say, just like the world needs garbage men, the world needs historical interpreters to tell these stories. And so if you're willing to, take on that challenge, by all means, you have the support of a lot of people who know that it's not easy to do. They might not understand, but it's not easy to do. And also, one of the last things I would suggest to do, is to surround yourself with a group of people who are a good group of people who will help you do research, who will also be there to share those experiences, especially when it comes to going to events and addressing the public. Though you are not doing this professionally, like the way people do it in museums, when you are addressing the public, you still have the obligation of educating the public. You can't show someone to a place that you've never been before. So you have to have at least decent understanding of what you're talking about in order to guide someone to what you already know. And it's not easy. It's pretty hard. You got to put some time into it. This is why I use these metaphoric sort of illustrations, because it helps me not only organize my thoughts, but it also helps you to tell the story from start to finish so that someone else could also understand it and even possibly help you with more stuff. You never know who you're going to meet. The reenacting community is very strange in that way, where one minute you're chilling out with buddies, the next minute you're going to Brooklyn so you could be casted in a tableau at the Museum of the American Revolution. Just like that. That's how fast
exactly.
Right? So that was my life.
Daryian Kelton. I think we could talk for like 3 more hours and we'd still have more to talk about. But
there's so much.
This is a good start. It's a good start, and I appreciate you so much. I appreciate everything that you're doing, and just know that we're all holding you up and supporting you, and so very grateful for your knowledge and your experience and what you're doing for the world. So thank you so much. And thanks for coming to have this conversation. I'll have all of Daryian's social and YouTube and all that stuff. So wherever you're watching it, you'll be able to find him. I know that Daryian's working, like I said earlier, working on some programs to help people get into the community, to get that access. So there's more of that to come, to make sure that you're following him on Instagram or Facebook. Thank you so much.
No problem.